Hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and we're going to be talking about sound money today. Specifically, we'll be talking about sound money and why it is so important that we avoid central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. This is an issue that whose time has come here for Idahoans, and it's a bandwagon we do not want to be on in terms of adopting CBDCs, but it's something that can and probably should be headed off at the state level. I'll tell you more about it coming up.
Press Club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. Twice a week, I have the opportunity to sit down and go into a little more depth on some of the issues facing Idaho voters. Before I get to sound money, and specifically central bank digital currencies, I want to share an observation that someone pointed out to me earlier this week concerning ranked choice voting. Now, ranked choice voting is going to be on the ballot this November. It's a choice that Idahoans are being asked to make. Do you want to have these open primaries? Do you want to have this instant runoff called ranked choice voting? And there are several good reasons. In fact, there are numerous good reasons why you shouldn't adopt it. The one person, one vote, let the parties as private entities, choose their starting lineup, not to let everybody else on the opposing team choose their starting lineup. But this is one of the things that I thought was very interesting. And I would encourage you, put this to the test. See if this pans out. Can you think of a single vehement, diehard supporter of ranked choice voting who would be voting for Donald Trump? Okay, now this is not a Trump campaign ad. I'm just asking you to make the connection here. Can you think of anyone within the ranked choice voting ranks who isn't on Team Kamala? I don't know the answer for sure. I'm asking you to maybe think about it a little bit yourself. But, if the choice is between Trump and outright communism, which increasingly it looks like that is kind of the choice, kind of would make sense that people who would lean that way ideologically would support things like ranked choice voting, muddying the water, complicating things that don't need to be complicated. Anyway, with that observation, let's talk about sound money. So I want to point you first toward an article by Nicholas Kleinworth. Loss wrote this. This was just published earlier today. How Idaho could become a paragon of financial liberty in 2025. Now, he covers a number of different topics, clearly identifies the problem that we're facing, but he also sounds a very clear warning about central bank digital currencies, which I will go into some detail in just a few moments. Law starts by pointing out that rising prices, growing surveillance, reduced financial access have given rise to Idahoans' concerns for their savings, their privacy, and their livelihoods. He says now is the time for Idaho to join her peers and provide relief through sound money solutions. In fact, he says Idaho not only has an opportunity to make real change, but also to become an example for other states to emulate. Now, the inflationary government spending that we're facing right now, he says, is likely to continue. So he recommends that, the federal government, it has failed to manage the financial system well. And if in case you didn't know, Congress suspended the debt ceiling, removing any control on debt accrual, and the little leverage conservatives had to force change. So as of the time he wrote this article, the debt is approaching $105,000 per citizen. Now, he says, even as the federal government does a terrible job of managing its own finances, it's still looking for more control over your finances. In fact, the Biden administration directed bureaucrats to develop a central bank digital currency, or CBDC, to do this, welcoming a future where it can surveil and control Americans' finances with pinpoint accuracy. By the way, a good example of this mindset is the idea that, billions of dollars have been missing or squandered or disappeared. And, there's really no sense of accountability. I mean, how many billions of dollars of military equipment were left behind in Afghanistan? And yet, we're told, it's no big deal. We just write it off. It's really nothing to worry about. And yet the IRS is all up in your business over about that $600 that you got. See, there's a very out of balance thing that's taking place here. And this is something that Nicholas is pointing out. It will only get worse with central bank digital currency. He also points out that censorship and control can pertaining to your finances are not too far from home. Why, it wasn't that long ago that Idaho's Central Credit Union faced public backlash for updating their policy to ban firearm purchases, something they noted as an industry standard. Well, everybody else is doing it, so maybe we should. It's like a mind virus. This brings the issue of debanking and silencing those who don't align with environmental, social governance, or the ESG agenda close to home for Idahoans. Now, to be fair, Idaho Central Credit Union backed away from this quickly because they heard from a lot of people who said, we don't like this. But the point that Loss is making here is that to fight these new and growing threats to financial liberty, Idaho must enact a sound money agenda in January. So I'll hit a couple of the high points, and then I'm going to get on to the central bank digital currency. To start with, he says the state needs to reduce its dependency on federal funding to support operations. Federal funding supports nearly 2/5 of the entire state budget, but much of it could go away once pandemic relief funds expire in 2026. Thus, lawmakers don't need to pass any new policies to reduce federal influence. They only need the willpower to say no to policies that make temporary COVID programs and their funding permanent. That's going to take some strong willpower. That money is very seductive. Idaho should also prioritize banning the state from accepting and utilizing a central bank digital currency. Now, Law says Idaho should withdraw from any programs that are contingent on participation in a CBDC. And there should also be strong provisions for recourse against bureaucrats who violate this law. Though a CBDC ban is critical, it can be ineffective at preventing the federal government from compelling private individuals to use it. In other words, the state interposes itself between the federal government and its citizens. So he says Idaho needs to enact policies that allow private alternatives to the banking system to flourish. This provides an emergency exit for individuals, defending them against the imposition of a CBDC. Now, these policies would include defending the right to mine, hold, and transact digital assets like Bitcoin. There should also be provisions to protect digital asset miners intending to do business in the state. In this vein, he says Idaho should also exercise the authority granted by the U.S. Constitution to make gold and silver legal tender. Idaho should not limit the scope of the bill to only federally issued bullion and coin, but include all gold and silver with certified weight and purity, kind of like the model that we see in the state of Arkansas. He also says that the gem state should safeguard taxpayer funds from inflation by putting gold and silver on the balance sheet. This is actually a very wise recommendation. Expanding on the work in Utah, Idaho should hold these assets directly. In whole, this policy will save taxpayers from having to fund losses to the dollar's value. Now, just a quick note on this. Do you realize that the largest gold and silver depository west of the Mississippi now resides in Idaho? Maybe you didn't know that, but something that might be handy should lawmakers decide to put some of the state's money into tangible physical money. Idaho, he says, should also end the practice of debanking, defined as political and religious discrimination by financial institutions. Though banks are technically private entities, they're also so heavily regulated that they're vectors for government surveillance and censorship. And he says it's time that this practice is outlawed. Finally, he says it should be harder for bureaucrats to conduct warrantless surveillance of your finances. Now, this could be a problem, even for those who use digital assets instead of the dollar for their transactions. Protections that bolster Americans' Fourth Amendment rights are essential for true financial freedom. And adopting these policies in whole would allow Idahoans to prosper through improved privacy, secured savings, and expanded financial access. Does it mean doing things differently than we're doing right now? To a degree, yes. Well, change is scary. Yes, it is. But sometimes it's the right thing to do, especially if the system under which you're operating is opening you up to vulnerabilities in terms of your privacy, in terms of the soundness of your money, or in terms of keeping your money within your reach and not making it a subject rather to the whim of whoever happens to be in power at that moment. All right, let's talk about CBDCs. Go to an article here from Jeff Thomas, who is from the website International Man. This was actually published a couple of years ago on LouRockwell.com. Why is it that bank depositors would accept the introduction of CBDCs? Okay, try to look at it from their point of view. On paper, they sound great. No more trips to the ATM, no more need for credit cards, no more worrying about carrying around cash, no more purse snatchers. You could carry all your savings on a cell phone and do so safely. All crime could end as any criminal would leave a trail of transactions for banks to monitor. Now, you have to admit, that's pretty convenient. That could be a big selling point for a lot of people. But there's more to this. What's the attraction for governments and bankers so eager to go digital? Okay, for bankers, it's that they'll have the opportunity to phase out banknotes. Most activities on the retail floor will be outmoded. Since all transactions will be digital, they'll be performed by bank clerks on computers without ever having to face customers. Additionally, depositors will no longer be able to store their currency somewhere else. Depositors will be at the mercy of the banks, as they'll no longer be able to make even the smallest transaction without passing it through the bank. So this not only makes it possible for banks to decide to raise their transaction fees at will, but it gives them the ability to decide what transactions the depositor is allowed to make, as the depositor may no longer have any alternative transaction capability. See how that works? And as far as the government, well, the governments will not only have greater power over the movement of currency without the cost of producing banknotes, but they'll also have the ability to require banks to reveal all transactional information on depositors. You don't think the banks would tell them no, do you? At the very least, this will mean the ability to eliminate voluntary income taxes. Taxation will now be possible with direct debit. Boom, right out of your account. You won't even miss it. It also need not be subject to annual, but it could be carried out monthly with each bank statement, and rates subject to frequent unannounced change. Yeah, tell me that there's a politician out there who could resist that kind of mischief. But here's the worst part of it. Again, according to Jeff Thomas, governments will have the ability to establish a social credit system, as has China with its CBDC. In other words, a nanny with the power to allow people to make purchases based upon their performance as citizens. Have you attended a protest or been reported for having criticized the government? Well, you may not be allowed commercial travel for a period of time, or you may not be allowed to purchase, say, petrol for your car. So the ability to live as a free person will most certainly be curtailed in small ways initially, but becoming more draconian with time. Those who displease their governments will be punished. Those who obey will have the privilege of freedom of transaction. I understand it's a worst case scenario. Well, they're not going to do that right away, but ask yourself, are they opening the door to where it's possible to do stuff like that? The answer is absolutely, unequivocally, yes. So why give that opportunity? Why not maintain options or even open up options that you don't currently have? In the name of protecting your savings, in the name of protecting your access to your money, deciding how you best spend it, and not making it subject to some bureaucrat's whims. CBDCs promise to give us a lot of convenience, but it will take a lot in return that we really shouldn't be willing to give up. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Idaho Press Club are biased all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.